2018. The year is almost over, and as it wraps up, we take a look at the stories that impacted us the most. From those we lost to misconduct and malfeasance in the government, as well as the stories that will continue to change our lives in the months to come, from paying for your child's education to a brand new governor. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. We're going to take a slightly different format today as we review 10 of the biggest stories of the last year, the ones we'll never forget and the ones that will change us forever. Joining me on the desk today, we have Diane Leffler from the Wichita Eagle and Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist with Friends University. Thank you both so much.
Glad to be here.
So we're going to dive right in. Our first story is number 10 on our list. It's the series of prison riots that we saw in Kansas this last year and the staffing shortages that they highlighted. Now, this is an issue that kind of took some folks by surprise, but the folks who are working in the prisons, they certainly knew what was going on.
Oh yeah, they weren't surprised at all.
If anything, they were surprised that it's been so long. It had taken so long for this problem to develop to the point where there were outbreaks.
Yeah.
So what is it about this story that makes it a big story that is going to stick out for this year?
Well, I think one thing about it is it's a little bit unusual for Kansas. I mean, we haven't had a lot of that go on here. I mean, there's other places in America where, it's like, oh, yeah, prison riot. It's Wednesday, but
prison riots are associated with like large urban populations, and that is not the sort of way in which most people kind of conceptualize the criminal population of Kansas. But as I mentioned before, I mean, when you have long developing funding problems, staffing problems, people just not paying attention to what it costs to run a prison system, then it was inevitable that you were going to see, people starting to act out and guards either not being able to respond or responding poorly because of lack of training. I mean, I suspect one of the reasons why it'll stay with us is because people recognize that unless we get a handle on this situation, there's actually no reasons why in the future those more, kind of urban reputations might become more typical here in Kansas. So
you're on board as saying you think this is going to continue to be a story next year. What about you?
I think it'll continue to be a story. One thing that happens is once it calms down, people tend to forget.
Yeah.
And that's something that hopefully the legislature will pay attention to.
All right. Well, we'll have to find out. Next up at number 9, this summer's primary race for governor between an uber-tight race for the Republican nomination for governor, leaving Governor Collier just a handful of votes away from Secretary of State Chris Kobach, and then problems with reporting in Johnson County. It was an election night that lasted a whole week. So what is it? I mean, obviously it was unusual, but what is it that made this a story that just really sang and kept Kansans paying attention?
Well, I think that the top thing to me was that for quite a while there, we didn't know who the governor was going to be, and that almost never happens. So it's like, back and forth between Collier and that back and forth between Collier and Kobach, it was like,
It was like a 2000 again.
Well, I'm sitting there and we're, I'm doing stories and my colleagues are doing stories up north about, how this county is going to count these provisional ballots and this county's not counting those same provisional ballots, and is this going to be a lawsuit? And, all these things and all these just pieces are just flying all over the place. Right. It was like, it was like your lawnmower blowing up.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the significance of the story, I mean, besides the obvious fact that you were deciding who a candidate for governor was going to be, the conflict between Kobach and Collier in a lot of ways fed into divisions that we know exist within the Kansas Republican Party, to the extent that we're also talking about the treatment of absentee ballots and mail-in ballots and so forth. It's part of this ongoing discussion that's just heating up about the integrity of our democratic procedures in America. And one last thing that I think is very particular to what happened here in Kansas, but I think has some real legs going forward, the question of should Chris Kobach had been obliged to recuse himself because as Secretary of State, he was at least nominally in charge of an election that he was running in. The same sort of thing was taking place in Georgia. And because you've had 2 states where it was really close, I suspect that we're going to see this issue come back about the Secretary of State office within state elections.
Okay. So probably going to see this one again, perhaps during the legislature as they deal with voting issues.
Oh yeah, we'll see it in the legislature as they deal with voting issues. We will see it in the next election. We will see it in the election after that, and the one after that.
Well, we're still talking about 2000 and hanging chads and pregnant chads, so
Very true.
Yeah. There we go. It's going to be around a while.
Yep.
It was hard, but I did put school funding at number 8 on this list. I could easily have put it at number 1. We talked about the problems and the ongoing lawsuits over school funding here so often. The latest court ruling sending lawmakers back to the drawing board to find an unspecified amount of more money is where we're at with this case as we go into the next session. There's no doubt this one is going to still be a hot topic over the next year.
Oh yeah, and I mean, it never ends.
Yeah.
No matter how much you would want it to, it never ends.
As long as you have language in the Constitution that talks about suitable levels of funding, then people are always going to potentially have a legal argument to be made completely outside of the political process. That said, I don't think you're wrong to put it as number 8, because there's 2 things about the argument over school funding as it exists right now that are maybe different from where they were right now in 2017. 1, we've got a Democratic governor. 2, you have a state Supreme Court that is actually kind of signed off on the formula they've come up with. They have said you need more money, but they're not throwing out the whole thing, which has been in the case in the past. Wow. So that's takes a little bit of the heat off, I think.
But the other thing that's going to happen, I mean, we're already hearing legislators talking about redoing the formula.
Yeah, well, and then of course the whole constitutional amendment issue, getting back to what you said about as long as that language is there, it's going to be an issue. Some lawmakers, Republicans in particular, want to change that and remove that as a possibility. All right. So as we move to number 7, we take a serious turn. The story of Andrew Finch's death in a swatting incident in Wichita actually started last December, but the results showed up on this show again and again, from discovering what swatting is, the arrest of Tyler Barris, to changes in state law. And you and I have covered both of those at various different points. This is a story that just really, to me, it was as much the shock value because we had an innocent person, and so many of us had never even heard of what swatting was.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was certainly the case with me. I mean, when you talk about the shock, the shock to me was mostly kind of this embarrassed realization that, well, of course people must have been doing this sort of thing. This is the sort of thing that the existing technology and the existing gaming culture makes very easy to imagine, and yet I'd never heard of it, and probably a lot of other people had never heard of it as well. I mean, you guys are closer to crime reporting than I am, so maybe you were familiar with it, but you had not been?
No, we really had never heard of this before. I mean,
well, even the prosecuting attorney, the federal prosecuting attorney, said he'd never heard of it.
Yeah, and
so
I wonder if, you know, again, maybe that's a function of Kansas just not being a big metropolitan, high-tech, you know, heavy, you know, in terms of media concentration state. I don't know.
I'm going to say I think to a certain extent it may be a function of age, because every single one of the people that here and the people that we've mentioned who said they had never heard of it were all well above that 25 age range.
Right.
And I think if you probably get down to our young adults, late teens, they may have been more likely to have heard of it.
I'm reasonably sure my 24-year-old sons didn't know about it either.
Yeah. Well, I said may have.
Yeah.
See, I was just thinking, see, if we had on the panel today, you know, the editor of the Sunflower at Wichita State University, I'd be curious to see if he thought, oh my gosh, people are talking about that on Reddit all the time. Why don't you guys know?
Yeah. Well. We're not on Reddit.
Speak for yourself.
So, yeah.
It's silly. I mean, here we are kind of laughing about our own ignorance. It was, of course, a horrible tragedy.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, besides the significance and the newness of the way in which this tragedy was perpetuated, there's the age-old, tragically, reality of questions about police behavior, questions about procedure, and all of that sort of stuff.
And I think if this story does continue to go into next year, that's where it will be at, is those questions that it raised about how these things happen and how could an innocent man at his own front door end up dead.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that story may potentially continue into the next year. Well, things didn't get any better. Another story that hit especially hard for many of us. At number 6, the death of Deputy Robert Kunze, shot in the line of duty. Responding to a suspicious character call, the deputy put himself between an armed suspect and county residents, as well as a fellow deputy on his way to provide backup. Nearly the entire city paused a week later to honor Kunze at his end of shift celebration. And I was very upfront with this as I was covering it for Cake. I had just barely started there, but Deputy Kunze lived in, was a member of, and was a law enforcement officer in the community that I live in. I did not know him personally, but so many of my friends in the area, former students, former co-workers, all knew him personally, and it just ripped them apart. This hit a huge part of the community, and I think it's one that even if it doesn't continue to be a story as far as new developments, it will continue to affect people.
Well, it's it continues because it is part of the horrible, difficult, tragic dimension of wrestling with the prior story. I mean, on the one hand, we have brave men and women who take upon themselves the responsibility of trying to enforce the order, often at the risk of their own lives. And because these people are empowered to take on that responsibility, when horrible mistakes are made and when there are procedures that don't seem to fit the situation and unarmed innocent people get killed, there can be a kind of a perverse opposite reaction to it. And so, I see this very sad story as being a necessary counterpoint to the previous story. If we're going to talk about police behavior and police procedures, we do it in light of the sacrifices of somebody like Deputy Kunze.
All right. Yeah. And I don't think there's anything more to say on that one. As we move on, it is hard to put this one on a numbered list at all, but we couldn't leave it out either. 2 little boys who captured Kansans' hearts with the tragedy of their deaths. Evan Brewer died at the hands of his mother's boyfriend last year. His mother testified in October against that boyfriend, sending him to prison. Lucas Hernandez, his disappearance in February sparked a massive hunt that spread through the city and out into the county and lasted for weeks. Eventually, a special team of searchers found his body under a culvert in rural Harvey County. Prosecutors wanted to charge his father's girlfriend with Lucas's death, but she committed suicide. And that case was still under investigation when that happened. And I mean, it made national headlines, international headlines, and people were turning out from all over the city to join these searches.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's, there were both just unspeakably tragic cases.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even like to contemplate the details of these cases because I know some
Yeah.
of them, and it just I mean, it literally is just a heartbreaking story, and will it continue? God, I hope not.
Yeah.
It's like, hopefully we've learned something from these cases that maybe we can take forward and prevent these kind of tragedies in the future, because that's all you can say.
Yeah. And yet you and I both know as journalists, we have covered cases like this over our careers. For me, Iowa, you, California, and then here in Kansas, they do happen every once in a while. I think perhaps the fact that we had 2 of them so close to each other within the same community kind of played into that.
Yeah.
And, they're going to stay alive. I mean, that was a horrible way to put it. Their stories are going to stay relevant because, especially with the incoming administration, we're wrestling with DCF and all of the ways in which that organization, to say nothing of many other people that could have been there, failed 2 young people.
Yeah. 2 people who should be with us today.
Yeah.
Well, how to protect our children while they're at school became a huge part of our national dialogue after the shootings at Parkland High School in Florida. That discussion came in at number 4 on our list today. And truly, I mean, this thing really became huge. We've had school shootings before, but I've never done stories before or watched stories before of Kevlar in backpacks to make them bulletproof. and how to harden a school, and whether or not teachers should go to school armed. So many different aspects came up, and yet we haven't seen any change. Not really.
Well, I mean, we haven't seen any change in what sense? What's the change you're looking at? I mean, if you think about these things as political problems, obviously we're not at the point yet where one side or another within this political struggle over gun rights, over school safety, and all the rest have been able to decisively defeat the others. But I mean, you have seen massive organization on a scale that is really rather unprecedented in terms of young people, teenagers, people under voting age, getting involved in terms of trying to promote their particular cause. So you see stuff continuing to shift. You see things continuing to develop. But I mean, like, if you're asking for a solution, people are still profoundly divided over how you measure these different rights and freedoms.
Well, and I'm looking at it as a mother and, from also as a teacher from my students' perspectives. Students still don't feel safe going to school. And that's where nothing has changed. Students still don't feel any safer now than they did 12 months ago going to school. And we've done the stories. I can remember when I was in college coming into work at WITV and seeing what was going on at Columbine.
Yeah.
We're recording this on, I think, the 6th anniversary, or maybe yesterday was the 6th anniversary of the Newton shooting.
Yeah.
All of the primary age children killed there.
Yeah. So.
Well, the thing that really struck me on this particular year of stories was all the fake news that came out, and that was the most infuriating part of this, because if we're going to solve this problem, we have to solve it on a factual level.
Well, and we need to listen to the kids and not dismiss them. And I think, to me, that's what was at the base of so much of those fake news stories.
Right, but when you see stuff pop up on your Facebook feed, oh well, this student is a paid actor paid by George Soros to pretend to have gone to this school. It's like, just shut up. We don't need that. We got real problems here. Let the grown-ups talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as I think we've all agreed, certainly a story that is not going away in 2019.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, number 3 went viral on an international scale. That was the fight and lawsuit over how many polling sites Dodge City should have and where they should be located after the county clerk moved the city's only voting site outside the city limits. And this is one we know is continuing. There's no doubt about that. The lawsuit that the ACLU filed is still underway. Last time I looked, that no hearings had been scheduled yet, but we know that there will be something. It's not going away.
Yeah. It was pretty cool being out there on that day.
You got to be out there?
I was there, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I had one of my students out there who was working to drive people out to the new polling station.
Yeah.
And I mean, given the fact that that sort of obstacle really shouldn't exist, it does seem like people organized to make it work as much as possible for the people of Dodge City.
I mean, people pulled together. I was talking to people. They drove in from like San Diego just to drive people back and forth to the polls in Dodge City. And frankly, for most of the day, you had more people wanting to give people rides than you had people needing rides.
Which gets to a whole nother story, which isn't even on this list, which is the number of Kansans who are and aren't registered and how many of them actually vote once they are.
And honestly, one of the things that I found out there was it really wasn't all that easy to vote there in the first place, because they only have one polling place for Dodge City, which is maybe they might need maybe they might want to think about having more than one. But the one that they had was actually kind of it's in a community building that's sort of a little bit hard to get to. So it's like, I'm wondering if the big rodeo arena south of town may have not been a better venue.
Wasn't one of the original reasons for the move in the first place that community building wasn't handicap accessible, and so they had to find
No, actually they moved all of them into that building because it was the only facility that was handicap accessible.
Okay.
The reason they had to move it this time was that they were expecting construction to start, and they expected that to become an issue as far as parking and people walking across roads and that sort of stuff.
But the city, man, they had people, you know, they had the
Yeah.
buses and stuff. They diverted buses to pick up people. They had buses there at the community building in case somebody showed up. I took a ride with a couple of guys. They were immigrants. It was fun. It was their first time to vote, you know,
Yeah.
and they
That's
just,
great.
you know, they just had a great time.
Though I wonder
Okay, I've got a
if-
question. Did everybody cheer when they voted? Did they get like applause and everything?
No, that
Because
was
that
just-
happened at my polling site.
Oh, okay.
The first time
Really?
voters got cheers and applause. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I wonder if all of the buses would have been there, all the volunteers would have been there,
If it
if
hadn't
there
have
hadn't
made the
been for
headlines.
people who were making it an issue.
Right.
So
Yeah.
who's to say that's a counterfactual? As for the ACLU lawsuit, I mean, that's going to result in something that people will have different responses to. It's going to become part of this ongoing argument that I mentioned before, this argument about the integrity of our democratic processes. So, I mean, it's going to fit right into that stream, which is, you know, only going to continue to flow stronger and stronger.
But it was heartening, though, to see that when the process is threatened, if you will, that, you know, there were many people who were standing up and saying, no, you know, we're gonna make sure people can vote. This is important to
you had
us.
private individuals, you had organizations, you had businesses. I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
like Uber saying that they were going to drive people, or Lyft, or
Lyft, I think it was. Yeah.
Well, there were a couple of ladies in Lawrence. They rented a party bus or tour bus.
Really?
They rented a tour bus and drove it to Dodge City.
My word.
You
That's
know, and it's
fantastic.
like, you know, when you see that kind of reaction, you really do start to, you know, it is heartening to know that there are people out there who say, you know, voting is so important that I am willing to go to these lengths. I am willing to come, you know, I'm willing to put my money down and rent a bus to go take people to those polling
Wow,
places. It's like,
that's just
Yeah.
That's awesome.
fabulous.
Now that's what makes America great.
Yeah.
I love that. And of course, I'm a huge proponent of getting registered and getting out to vote. So, but the fact that somebody is going to put their own money where their mouth is,
Yeah.
Yeah.
wow, that's huge. I envy you the chance to cover that story.
It was fun.
All right, so moving to number 2, it's a story that's sure to continue to be an issue into next year, the persistent and pervasive problems at the Department of Children and Families. From lawsuits accusing the department of making children homeless to children raped or sexually assaulted, I should say, while sleeping on office floors because of a lack of foster homes. Lawmakers are determined to make changes this next session. And they just wrapped up the Child Welfare Task Force and sent 24 reforms to lawmakers to work on this. And I think one that just really stuck out to me and kind of is maybe perhaps a really prime example of why so many of these things are falling through the cracks. They have 9 separate computer systems that don't talk to each other. So they have to enter the information in each computer system distinctly. It's no wonder things are falling through the cracks.
Like at different offices, or like within the same office running different systems?
That I'm not sure about.
Weird.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know,
I guess it's multiplying government contracts and it's
No.
employing people. I mean, it's nothing to laugh at.
Yeah.
The problems at DCF, I mean, they're related to obviously the tragedies with Lucas Hernandez and Evan Brewer. They're also related to what's going on in the state's prisons. I mean, these questions of training and funding and coordination and communication, they're endemic across our state bureaucracies.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm still skeptical, I guess. You know, I've seen these courageous reform efforts come along and I've seen them go. And, you know, hopefully this is the time that people actually, you know, that the legislature will actually get serious about this. There's not, I mean, some of these problems are going to require money.
Yeah.
And people don't want to
spend the money.
to cut loose the money.
No.
You know, so it's really, you know, I mean, we've just so many years of, you know, children that should be protected who aren't, children who didn't need to be protected being taken from their homes, you know, and just this whole swirl of all this taking place backstage behind a cloak of invisibility. Where, you know, it's like, oh, we can't tell you that. That's confidential. We can't even give you, you know, we can't even give you aggregate figures because it's confidential, and you might be able to figure. You know, it's like, it really, you know, that if ever I saw an agency that needed some rays of sunshine into it, That's a
Agreed.
one.
Agreed. One thing we can say is that we know that Governor-elect Kelly has made reforms to DCF one of her top priorities. So we know it's not going away, at least. Whether it's successful, that's another story. Yeah. And we'll just have to wait and find out what that story is.
Yeah.
And the number one story this year, Kansas has a new governor, if you didn't know that. A Democrat who has plans to go in precisely the opposite direction of the much derided Governor Sam Brownback. Now, of course, she's not directly following him. She's following his lieutenant governor, who filled in his shoes after he left to become an ambassador. But in most people's minds, this is the next administration. Mm-hmm. Huge story, national headlines. We had national networks at both Kelly and Kobach watch parties on election night. So this is not just about Kansas, and yet it is more about Kansas than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Kobach was a notorious enough figure because of his appearances on Fox News, because of his very outsized portfolio and personality, that sure, he attracted national attention. But for the state of Kansas, this is the big story of the year, both in terms of policy and in terms of politics. Policy definitely because you have a governor that can veto things. You know, the Brownback tax experiment will not come back in any form whatsoever. And politically, it's important because given the way Brownback shifted the politics and the relationship between Republicans and Democrats in the state, having a Democrat in the governor's mansion really matters.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what Democratic governors can do in Kansas is their power is limited, I think, in terms of trying to set an agenda, but they can head off a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, so that was kind of the dynamic we saw really with Parkinson, to a certain extent Sebelius, but I think that's going to be something that we're going to see in this case is, you know, and I think we're probably looking at some of those. Remember those really late nights at the Capitol?
Yes, all too well.
We're going to see those again.
Yeah, I have my bags ready. They're not packed yet, but they're ready. I'll wait for January to pack them. But okay, so this whole list was me. I sat down and thought, what are the biggest stories? And then I tried to think of a logical order. So I want to know, what stories do you guys think I left out, and where should they be very quickly on this list? I know you've already got something ready.
Oh yeah. Bill Snyder. What that man meant to Kansas. I mean, you know, 2/3, 3/4 of Kansas has lived and died by this football team at K-State. The coach who built it has retired, as probably everybody knows by now.
So where does that go on the list?
I'm going no lower than 4.
All right. Well, for that, we're out of time. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. And thank you for being with us as we went over this and all year long. With this, we're signing off for 2018. Kansas Week will be back in January 2019 with new shows following, among other things, what's going on in the State House as lawmakers get back to work. For now, have a great week and Happy New Year.